On the 25th of August, 1942, a Japanese naval commander named Shojiro Hayashi stood on the deck of a transport ship approaching the eastern tip of New Guinea and issued an order that has been preserved, word for word, in the archives of the Australian War Memorial. The order read, "At the dead of night, quickly complete the landing in the enemy area and strike the white soldiers without remorse. Unitedly smash to pieces the enemy lines and take the aerodrome by storm." His landing barges carried not just assault troops, but meteorological equipment and spare aircraft fuel tanks. The airfields were considered a foregone conclusion. The entire operation was expected to be over in hours. Tell me in the comments, had you ever heard of the Battle of Milne Bay before today? Because what happened next obliterated one of the most dangerous lies the Allied world had told itself about the Second World War. Watch until the end. What you are about to discover changed the course of the entire Pacific campaign, and almost nobody knows it. To understand what was waiting for Commander Hayashi in that bay, you must first understand the world that produced his confidence. In the 9 months between December 1941 and August 1942, the Imperial Japanese military had achieved something that no army in modern history had replicated at such speed and across such distance. Pearl Harbor fell in a single morning. Malaya, a campaign the British had spent years preparing to defend, collapsed in 53 days under a Japanese force that was outnumbered by the defenders it destroyed. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable fortress that anchored British power in Asia, surrendered on the 15th of February 1942 in what Winston Churchill privately called the greatest disaster in British military history. 85,000 soldiers surrendered to a Japanese force of 35,000. The Dutch East Indies followed. Timor followed. The Philippines followed. With each collapse, each retreat, each evacuation under fire, a single idea embedded itself deeper into the collective psychology of every Allied commander, every Allied soldier, and every Allied government in the Pacific. The Japanese could not be stopped on land. This was not simply a matter of morale. It was a strategic operating assumption that shaped every Allied decision made in those months. When Japanese forces moved through jungle, they were considered supernatural at it. When they outflanked a position, the assumption was that the position had always been weak. When they charged, they would break through. The idea of fighting them to a standstill, let alone driving them backward, had been rendered almost literally unthinkable by the accumulated weight of unbroken defeat. The doctrine that had failed in Malaya was examined, found wanting, and then quietly restored, because nobody in authority could imagine what might replace it. The only time the Japanese advance had been checked at all was at sea, in the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, where an Allied naval force turned back a Japanese amphibious attempt to seize Port Moresby from the ocean. But that was carrier aircraft and naval gunfire operating across open water. On land, across the breadth of the Pacific, the Japanese army had never once been compelled to retreat. That fact hung over every Allied calculation like a permanent weather system, and everyone operating beneath it had adjusted their expectations accordingly. Port Moresby, the capital of Papua on the southern coast of New Guinea, was the only substantial Allied airbase anywhere on the island. It was the forward shield for northern Australia. Its fall would sever the supply lines between the United States and Australia, give Japan a platform from which to strike the Australian mainland directly, and trap the Allied forces fighting to hold the Pacific in an impossible strategic position. In July 1942, the Japanese attempted the overland route to Moresby, landing at Buna and Gona on New Guinea's northern coast, and pushing south toward the Owen Stanley Range via a jungle track called the Kokoda. The Australian militia battalions holding the track were being pushed backward day by day, fighting ferociously but losing ground to a Japanese force that had superior numbers, superior experience, and the terrifying momentum of an undefeated army. General Douglas MacArthur, who had arrived in Australia from the Philippines in March after a humiliating retreat that he had managed to transform into a public relations triumph through the sheer force of his own self-promotion, sat at his headquarters in Brisbane, issuing orders he believed were simple and receiving reports he believed were exaggerated. He had not visited Papua. He had no intention of doing so. He had already decided what was happening and what ought to be done about it. And the distance between those two things and reality was a gap he showed no interest in closing. It was in this atmosphere of genuine existential fear, when the fall of Australia itself was a serious military and political consideration, and not a theoretical one, that both sides fixed their attention on a wretched, swamp-ridden bay at the far eastern tip of New Guinea. Milne Bay is a V-shaped rift that cuts 30 kilometers into the eastern tip of the island, surrounded on both its northern and southern flanks by the Stirling Ranges, which rise to 1,500 meters and are covered in dense jungle and kunai grass, so thick that soldiers would later cut through it with bayonets because no machetes had been issued. The bay itself is deep enough for ocean-going vessels, which is part of what made it militarily valuable in a theater where deep-water harbors were rare. The land at the head of the bay, where the only flat ground existed, received approximately 5,100 millimeters of rain per year, around 200 inches. And after any significant rainfall, the coastal plain became what one military report described as a virtually impassable quagmire of glutinous mud. An Australian soldier who served there wrote afterward that there were two types of weather at Milne Bay: summertime, rains every day, and wintertime, rains all day. The place was endemic with malaria. The insects were biblical in their abundance. The heat that pressed down through the forest canopy was the kind of heat that drained a man of his will to move before he had taken 50 steps. One veteran captured the essential truth of it simply. Even without the war, he wrote, Milne Bay would have been a hellhole. It was a terrible place. The sun hardly ever shined, and it rained all the time. It was stinking hot and bog holes everywhere, and it was very marshy, boggy country. Even without the Japanese, it would have been hard to live there. It was a disease-ridden place. It was terrible. What made this particular hellhole strategically irreplaceable was its geography. Aircraft based at Milne Bay could reach Japanese positions at Rabaul and dominate the sea lanes between New Guinea and the Solomon Islands without first having to climb over the Owen Stanley Range, which added hours to every flight and reduced bomb loads to compensate for the fuel consumed in the climb. Bombers flying from Milne Bay could attack the Japanese northern coast of Papua in direct support of the Kokoda track fighting, providing the kind of close air support that could turn a defensive line into something survivable. Any Japanese force that seized the bay would gain a naval base from which to threaten Allied shipping throughout the Southwest Pacific, and a forward airfield from which to provide the air cover their Kokoda thrust desperately needed for its final push on Port Moresby. The two sides had identified the same piece of real estate for mirror image reasons, and the race to control it would determine the outcome of the entire New Guinea campaign. One side understood this completely. The other was about to find out. American engineers and Australian infantry arrived at Milne Bay on the 25th of June, 1942. The first task was simply to clear enough jungle for an airstrip, and the pace at which that was accomplished represents one of the quietly extraordinary achievements of the entire Pacific War. Papuan laborers worked alongside the troops in conditions that would have stopped most construction projects in peacetime. There were no machetes available, so men cut kunai grass with their bayonets and hacked at undergrowth with whatever tools could be improvised from what was on hand. Around 5,000 coconut palms were felled by hand for the second airstrip alone. The roads that existed were dirt tracks that turned to deep mud channels within hours of any significant rainfall, and vehicles attempting to use them sometimes had to be dug out by hand, or, in one recorded instance, lifted back onto firm ground by teams of Papuan laborers who sang in unison to coordinate the effort. The runways were covered in Marsden matting, a steel mesh designed to stop aircraft sinking into the mud. And when a Kitty Hawk fighter touched down on the soaked steel surface, the spray flew 10 feet in every direction, and the machine slithered to a halt in a film of brown water. Ground crews worked in ankle-deep mud around the clock to keep the aircraft serviceable. Royal Australian Air Force pilots described their initial impressions in terms that remained vivid decades later. Mud coating the aircraft on every landing, wheels sometimes sinking badly enough that a machine had to be dug out before it could taxi, heat that turned the cockpit into an oven between sorties, and dysentery and malaria already working through the squadrons before a single Japanese soldier appeared on the horizon. What the Japanese did not know, and what changed everything about what was coming, was that Allied codebreakers had intercepted and deciphered the Japanese operational plans in mid-July 1942. Commander Eric Nave's team in Melbourne informed MacArthur that toward the end of August, the Japanese planned to attack Milne Bay. They provided the precise units involved, the numbers expected, the standard of training, and the names of the ships allocated to the operation. It was, in the language of intelligence work, a comprehensive picture. MacArthur, for once, moved quickly. The 18th Brigade of the Australian 7th Division, veterans of the Siege of Tobruk, who had recently returned from the Middle East, was rushed to reinforce the garrison already at the bay, alongside the militia already there. By the 22nd of August, the total Allied force at Milne Bay numbered 8,824 personnel, of whom some 4,500 were combat infantry. The Japanese believed they were facing 2 or 3 companies, at most 600 men. The trap was set. The Japanese were walking toward it with full confidence and meteorological equipment. The man who would command that trap arrived at Milne Bay on the 13th of August on an American transport aircraft, piloted by a man who had no maps, no knowledge of the territory, and very nearly no fuel. The pilot had become lost in the low cloud and tropical rain that hung permanently over the mountains, and by the time the aircraft found the airstrip through a gap in the overcast, it was running on what remained after the margins for error had long been consumed. Major General Cyril Albert Close, who would command the Allied force at Milne Bay, later described the journey in a letter to his close friend, Sidney Rowell, with a dryly understated precision that captured everything about his character. "Yes, we did get here," he wrote, "largely by guess and by God." Clowes was 50 years old, born in Warwick, Queensland, on the 11th of March, 1892. He had entered the Royal Military College at Duntroon in 1911 and graduated on the 14th of August, 1914, the same week war was declared in Europe. He went ashore at Anzac Cove on the 25th of April, 1915, as a forward artillery observer directing naval gunfire against Turkish positions, was wounded there, and never entirely recovered his hearing in one ear. On the Western Front, he won a Military Cross in 1916 for directing raiding parties at Bois-Grenier under heavy shell fire, and a Distinguished Service Order in 1918 for the skillful deployment of the 2nd Division's artillery at the Battle of Villers-Bretonneux, a victory that has been called one of the most important single engagements of the entire First World War. Between the wars, he taught, planned, administered, and waited, holding positions that occupied his considerable abilities without fully testing them. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel in 1936 and traveled to England that year for a gunnery staff course, returning to Australia as the chief instructor at the School of Artillery in Sydney. In the Greek campaign of 1941, he directed the fighting withdrawal at Pineos Gorge in a manner that minimized casualties during a retreat that could easily have become a rout and likely saved hundreds of lives in the process. His colleagues at Duntroon had expected either Close or his close friend Sidney Rowell to become the first graduate of that institution to lead Australia's army. Instead, by August 1942, Rowell was commanding New Guinea force from Port Moresby, and Close had arrived at Milne Bay with one inaccurate hand-drawn map. No coastal defense guns, no searchlights, no four-wheel drive vehicles, no barges for moving troops along the bay, and intelligence estimates that placed the potential Japanese landing force anywhere between 1,200 and 5,000 men, depending on which signal had arrived most recently. The men who served under Close described someone so sparing with words that he had been nicknamed Silent Cyril. His chief staff officer, Colonel Fred Chilton, said of him, in words that functioned as both praise and elegy, that Close was a fine commander and a steady man. Cautious, thorough, completely unwilling to send back reports that made things sound better than they were. That last quality, Chilton noted with particular weight, would cost him more than the Japanese ever could. The force Close commanded contained two very different kinds of soldiers, and the distinction between them would matter enormously in the weeks ahead. The 7th Infantry Brigade, under Brigadier John Field, was composed of militia, citizen soldiers who had served only in Australia with no overseas combat experience, the 9th, 25th, and 61st Battalions, men who had trained for this war but had never lived it, who had learned to shoot and march and take orders, but had not yet learned the particular things that combat teaches, and nothing else can. MacArthur had already decided they were unreliable, and said so to anyone who would listen, repeatedly and with the unearned confidence of a man who had not recently stood in a trench himself. Close deployed the militia in the forward defensive positions along the northern shore of the bay, holding the terrain closest to the likely Japanese landing zones. It appeared to give the weakest troops the hardest task. It was nothing of the kind. Close was preserving his finest instrument for the decisive moment, and the militia would need to hold long enough for that moment to come. The 18th Infantry Brigade, under Brigadier George Wooten, was something altogether different from the militia stationed beside them. The 2nd 9th, 2nd 10th, and 2nd 12th Battalions had stood against Rommel's armor in the North African desert, and had survived the siege of Tobruk through months of daily aerial bombardment and infantry assault. They had been through the particular crucible that only extended combat creates, and they carried themselves with the quiet authority of men who had already met the worst their profession could deliver and come out the other side. When the 18th Brigade arrived at Milne Bay in mid-August, Private James Watt of the 61st Militia Battalion recalled the effect its arrival had on the men who had been anxiously waiting in the mud. "We thought they were saviors," he said. "We felt that these fellows from the Middle East must be great fighters, and they were good fighters too, as it turned out. We were very thrilled. Gee whiz, the 18th Brigade has come along. They looked as though they could have knocked over the Japanese quite easily without our help." The veterans were amused. Clowes held them in reserve and waited. 2 squadrons of Royal Australian Air Force Kitty Hawk fighters completed the Allied order of battle. No 75 Squadron, rebuilt after savage fighting over Port Moresby, where it had been the sole fighter defense of the town through 44 days of combat operations, was commanded by Squadron Leader Les Jackson. No 76 Squadron was commanded by Squadron Leader Peter Turnbull, a 25-year-old from Armidale in New South Wales, who had accumulated 12 aerial kills, flying Gladiators, Hurricanes, and Tomahawks in the Middle East and Syria before being posted to the Pacific. His colleagues called him the Flying Cowboy, a nickname that captured something essential about the way he flew, which was with an aggression that impressed even his peers. Flying alongside him was squadron leader Keith Truscott, whose nickname was Bluey on account of his red hair, and who had destroyed 11 German aircraft over England in Spitfires before arriving in Papua to find a Kitty Hawk and a mud-soaked runway waiting in their place. By the time he reached Milne Bay, Truscott was perhaps the most famous pilot in the Royal Australian Air Force, a Melbourne Football Club premiership player turned celebrated fighter ace who had been the subject of a public fundraising campaign in England, where red-headed Britons contributed money to buy him his own personal Spitfire. He had left it behind for Papua. Neither man appeared to consider this a hardship worth mentioning. There was one more soldier at Milne Bay whose story has been returned to, inadequately and belatedly, in the years since the battle ended. Corporal John Alexander French of the 2nd 9th Battalion was 28 years old. The son of a barber from Crow's Nest, a small Queensland town north of Toowoomba, he had been the first man from his community to enlist, signing his name in October 1939 with the straightforward purpose of a man who understood what was coming and did not intend to wait for it to find him. He had fought at Tobruk, in Libya, in Syria. He had survived things that had killed other men around him and returned to Australia in early 1942 with the calm competence of a soldier who has tested himself and found that he will not break. He was engaged to a woman named Dulcie McCowan, who was waiting in Australia and who described him as a quiet, steady boy, modest and unassuming, the stuff that real heroes are made of. His section knew him as Jack. He had 2 brothers serving as well, Eric in the Army and Gordon in the Royal Australian Air Force. The 7 days of leave he had spent in Crow's Nest in early 1942 were the last time his family would see him alive, though none of them knew it when he walked back out the gate. 500 kilometers to the north, at the massive Japanese naval base of Rabaul on the island of New Britain, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commander of the 8th Fleet, was completing calculations based on intelligence that was catastrophically wrong. His sources told him that Milne Bay was defended by 2 or 3 companies of infantry and supported by 20 to 30 aircraft. On the 20th of August, he ordered some 1,500 men to seize the bay in an operation given the codename R.E. Its success was considered so certain that the planning document might as well have been a property deed. Commander Shojiro Hayashi of the 5th Kure Special Naval Landing Force received operational command of the assault. The Special Naval Landing Forces were the Japanese Navy's elite infantry, Marines in everything but name, trained precisely for this kind of amphibious operation. They had participated in landings across the Pacific and Southeast Asia without a single defeat. They were professional, disciplined, and deeply conscious of their own record. On the 22nd of August, Hayashi issued his battle instructions to the assault force. The original document is preserved in the Australian War Memorials Archive in Canberra. The force will take possession of Milne Bay Aerodrome by a sudden attack, it reads. At the dead of night, quickly complete the landing in the enemy area and strike the white soldiers without remorse. Unitedly smash to pieces the enemy lines and take the aerodrome by storm. The landing barges were loaded accordingly. 12 motorized craft carried the assault infantry and, arranged alongside them, spare aircraft belly tanks, a petrol tanker, and a full meteorological team. The weather data would be needed as soon as the airfields were operational, which would be, by Hayashi's reckoning, within hours of the first boots touching the beach. 2 Type 95 Hago light tanks were loaded for armored support. No army in the Pacific had successfully stopped a Japanese amphibious landing. There was no reason to suppose that a handful of Australian companies would be the first exception. On the 25th of August, 1942, The day before the main landing, 9 Kitty Hawks from No. 75 Squadron, led by Flight Lieutenant John Piper, took off from Gurney Field at dawn and flew northeast toward Goodenough Island, 100 kilometers north of the bay. Allied coast watchers had reported Japanese barges in the area, believed to be part of a flanking force intended to land on the peninsula's northern coast and march south to attack the airfields from behind. Piper's Kitty Hawks found them, 12 to 14 barges drawn up bow first on the beach at Cape Watts, their decks loaded with equipment, each carrying Japanese troops in dark green uniforms. The camouflage on the barges had been applied in a hurry. From 10,000 feet, the Kitty Hawks rolled into their dives, each aircraft firing its full load of 1,500 rounds. 5 runs. The barges caught fire. 350 Japanese troops were now stranded on an island 100 kilometers from their objective, with no transport and no means of intervening in the battle developing to the south. Operation RE had lost roughly a third of its planned flanking force before the main landing had even begun. That night, in darkness and driving rain, Hayashi's convoy entered Milne Bay. The escort vessels of the 18th Naval Cruiser Squadron provided cover as the troops began landing on the northern shore near Wagga Wagga. The first operational failure struck immediately. The maps used to plan the landfall were primitive. Navigation in heavy rain and zero visibility was imprecise. When the troops came ashore, they found themselves not at their intended beachhead near the head of the bay, close to the airfields, but approximately 11 kilometers to the east of where they should have been. 11 kilometers may sound modest. At Milne Bay, in darkness, through jungle and swamp that reduced men to exhaustion after 100 meters of movement, 11 kilometers was the difference between a lightning coup and a grinding slog through one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The force ordered to seize the airfields by storm would have to fight its way to the starting line before the assault could even begin. 2 small Australian crash boats investigating the landing were caught in the darkness. One was sunk. 11 Australians died in the first contact of the battle. By dawn on the 26th of August, the Japanese, with their 2 tanks and their exhausted infantry, had reached the positions around KB Mission, a small religious missionary settlement on the northern shore, approximately 8 kilometers east of the Kitty Hawk base at Gurney Field. The 61st Militia Battalion was waiting for them there. The militia had no functioning anti-tank weapons that could be brought to the front in time. The sticky bomb grenades issued for use against armor proved useless against tanks in motion at combat ranges. The roads that might have allowed proper anti-tank guns to be moved forward had been transformed by 3 days of rain into channels of mud so deep that the guns could not be shifted along them. The 61st Battalion fought with what it had. It slowed the Japanese. It could not stop them. What halted the advance, at least temporarily, was the Royal Australian Air Force at first light on the 26th. No 75 and no 76 squadrons had been briefed the previous night. At dawn, they found the Japanese base area on the northern shore, the landing barges, the supply dumps, the equipment stacked on the beach waiting to be moved forward. 5 consecutive strafing runs. The pilots fired their complete ammunition loads on each pass. The barges caught fire and began to sink. The fuel drums exploded in towers of black smoke, visible from kilometers away. Lieutenant Chikanori Moji of the 5th Corps Special Naval Landing Force described what he found when he returned to the base area that night. In the darkness, he said, it presented a spectacle of ruin. The destruction of those barges was not a tactical setback. It was a strategic catastrophe for the entire operation. The Japanese had planned to use them to move troops along the coast, outflanking any defensive line the Australians constructed. Without them, every Japanese movement for the rest of the battle would be made on foot, through jungle and swamp, along a single coastal track. The Kitty Hawks had not simply destroyed property. They had eliminated an entire dimension of the Japanese operational plan in a single morning, and the battle had barely begun. The ground fighting through the 26th and into the following night acquired a character that became grimly familiar over the days ahead. In daylight, the Kitty Hawks dominated the battlefield. They strafed troop concentrations, destroyed surviving supply caches, and prevented any movement visible from the air. The Japanese came to dread the sound of Allison engines and the shadow they cast. In darkness, however, the tables turned entirely. The Japanese Navy owned the waters of the bay, and their destroyers could enter at night to provide gunfire support and land additional supplies, while the Kitty Hawks sat grounded. On land, the Japanese brought their particular skill at night, fighting to bear with terrible effectiveness. They called out in English in the jungle, using false orders and commands to confuse Australian officers into betraying their positions. Captured records noted that their men made free use of English phrases, some reportedly in very good English. One recorded taunting call, "Australian man, you go. Japan man, we come," received from somewhere in the Australian darkness, a reply that the official history has politely declined to reproduce in full. The darkness belonged to them, and they used every second of it. On the night of the 26th and 27th of August, the Japanese tanks pushed the 61st Battalion back from KB Mission. The militia fought through the settlement, lost it, attacked back into it alongside the 25th Battalion, and were eventually forced to withdraw under sustained armored pressure they could not overcome. The fighting was furious and confusing, conducted in rain and near total darkness, with neither side clearly seeing the other, and both sides suffering casualties that could not yet be accurately counted. The Japanese pressed westward through the night, with the confidence of men who had always pressed westward through the night and always found it worked. By dawn on the 27th, they were within reach of No. 3 airstrip, the easternmost of the strips under construction, not yet operational, but directly in the path of the advance. That morning, Squadron Leader Peter Turnbull led another attack on Japanese positions along the coastal track. In the afternoon, intelligence arrived that Japanese tanks were operating in the open on the shoreline road. Turnbull took off at dusk, with Flight Lieutenant Ron Kerville as his wingman. The two Kitty Hawks flew low along the coast, searching for the armor in the fading light. Kerville watched Turnbull roll into his attack dive, fire a long burst, and continue down, deeper than the run required, lower than the trees allowed. The aircraft clipped the jungle canopy. It rolled inverted, struck the trees, and disappeared into the undergrowth. Kerville called on the radio. There was no response. He circled once, twice, and received only silence. 12 kills, 25 years old. The flying cowboy was gone. Bluey Truscott assumed command of No. 76 Squadron before the day was out, and Turnbull's body would not be found until a patrol from the 2nd 12th Battalion located the wreckage 8 days later. The strip nearest to where Turnbull fell was renamed Turnbull Field in the weeks after the battle. It marked the furthest westward point the Japanese would ever reach, though no one at Milne Bay knew that yet on the morning of the 28th of August, when the Japanese arrived at the edge of the unfinished strip and the situation at the bay reached its most dangerous hour. Unable to operate from a strip that was under sporadic Japanese fire, the Kitty Hawks withdrew temporarily to Port Moresby. Royal Australian Air Force ground staff at Gurney began burning their code books. Soldiers of the 61st and 25th Battalions, holding a defensive line they knew was inadequate, listened to Japanese voices somewhere in the vegetation to the east. In at least one recorded instance, men of the garrison helped themselves to undamaged beer bottles from the canteen that had been blown open by Japanese artillery earlier that morning. The mundane logic of soldiers who understood that waiting requires something to do with your hands. The Kitty Hawks were coming back, Everyone knew that. But the tanks were at the wire, and the night was coming, and they had not come back yet. It was in those pre-dawn hours on the 28th that Sergeant Stan Steele of the 25th Battalion did something that deserves considerably more attention than the historical record has given it. He had 16 men and a machine gun, and he had found what he needed: a cleared aircraft dispersal bay running alongside the strip, a straight length of open ground that gave a well-positioned weapon genuine room to work. The Japanese advancing toward No. 3 airstrip would have to cross that clearing. He placed the gun at one end, positioned his men, and waited with the patience of a man who understood that the ground was doing half the work for him. As the Japanese entered the clearing in the pre-dawn darkness, the machine gun opened fire. The open ground that was supposed to give the enemy speed gave them nowhere to hide instead. It gave them nothing to shelter behind, and no angle from which to approach the gun without crossing the killing ground the sergeant had prepared for exactly this purpose. The engagement lasted 3 hours, from 5 in the morning until 8. Between 40 and 50 Japanese soldiers were dead in the clearing when it was over. The momentum of the advance, which had driven the militia backward for 3 consecutive days, broke against 16 men and 1 weapon placed in the right location by a man who understood his ground. The Japanese tanks, which had been the most demoralizing weapon in the enemy's arsenal since they first appeared rolling out of the darkness on the first night, were by this point fighting a different problem altogether. The mud of Milne Bay had already swallowed roads, defeated vehicles, and turned every movement into an ordeal that exhausted men before they had covered half the distance they intended. Now it swallowed the armor. Both Type 95 Hago tanks bogged to their axles in the soft ground beside the coastal track, and could not be recovered by any effort the Japanese engineers could bring to bear in the time available. The anti-tank grenades issued to the Australians had proven useless against the tanks when they were mobile. The Milne Bay mud accomplished in an afternoon what those grenades never had. Australian patrols found the 2 machines the following day and stood beside them with the particular satisfaction of soldiers who have been frightened by something and are now looking at its corpse. Klaus managed all of this from a headquarters that was fighting 2 battles simultaneously. From the east came the field reports, intermittent and incomplete, relayed through rain and jungle by telephone cable and runners who sometimes took hours to cover distances that would have taken minutes by road in any other conditions. From Brisbane came an entirely different kind of pressure. Throughout the battle, MacArthur's general headquarters sent multiple signals demanding detailed daily updates, urging faster action, warning of imminent Japanese reinforcements that had not yet materialized, and implying in terms that became progressively less diplomatic that the pace of operations was insufficient. Major General George Vesey, the Deputy Chief of the General Staff, wrote privately to Rowell on the 28th of August that the atmosphere at General Headquarters was like a bloody barometer in a cyclone, up and down every 2 minutes, and that a wrong impression of their troops had already been created in the minds of the great. One of MacArthur's intelligence warnings, based on information that placed the Japanese force at 5,000 men when the actual number was far lower, had been taken seriously enough by Close to shape his decisions about when to commit the 18th Brigade. He did not commit them prematurely because premature commitment, without clear information about Japanese strength and intentions, could have exposed the reserve to destruction in detail, leaving nothing to turn the battle when the decisive moment arrived. MacArthur, from Brisbane, continued to insist that he should act faster. MacArthur had never seen the ground. The Japanese had not finished. On the night of the 29th of August, a convoy escorted by a cruiser and 9 destroyers slipped into the bay under cover of mist and darkness and landed 770 reinforcements. 568 troops of the 3rd Cure Special Naval Landing Force and 200 men of the Yokosuka 5th came ashore in the darkness, while the Kitty Hawks were grounded and the Australian defenders could do nothing but listen. Their commander, Commander Minoru Yano, was senior to Hayashi and took command of operations the moment he came ashore. Yano surveyed what remained of the force that had landed 4 nights earlier. He found exhausted men, depleted ammunition, destroyed supplies, no functioning armor, and a casualty list already significant. He was a professional officer who recognized what the mathematics were telling him. He rested his men through the 29th and 30th, consolidated his positions carefully, and on the night of the 30th of August, committed everything his force could deliver to a single decisive assault. If there was a chance, this was it. He knew there would not be another. The Japanese attack on No. 3 airstrip began at 3 o'clock in the morning on the 31st of August, 1942. 3 separate assault waves charged the positions held by the 25th and 61st Battalions, the American 43rd Engineer Battalion, and the American 709th Anti-Aircraft Battery. Australian artillery had pre-registered the approaches during daylight, walking shells across the open ground until the gunners knew exactly how far each degree of adjustment would carry the point of impact. When the Japanese came across that ground in darkness, the shells found them with terrible accuracy. Mortars added their percussion. The machine guns of the defending battalions worked on fixed lines that needed no adjustment in the darkness because the Japanese were advancing into prepared fields of fire that had been set precisely for this moment. The first wave was stopped with severe casualties, and what remained of it fell back into the jungle. The second wave came and was stopped with heavier ones. Commander Hayashi personally led the third wave. He was killed in it, cut down somewhere in the open ground between the jungle and the wire. 2 more charges followed. They met the same fire and the same result. Wave after wave breaking against a defensive line that had been designed from the first day of its construction to do exactly this. Yano, taking command as each predecessor fell, led the survivors north in a final attempt to outflank the Australian positions on Stevens Ridge. A platoon of Australians met him there with Bren light machine guns. Just before dawn, the Japanese withdrew to the sound of a bugle call. It was the first time. In nearly 9 months of Pacific War, from Pearl Harbor to Guadalcanal, from Malaya to the Philippines, a Japanese assault had never been stopped cold and driven backward. The surviving Japanese troops, by their own after-action accounts, were shocked by the firepower that had been deployed against them. They had expected to overwhelm a small garrison. They had instead charged into the full defensive capacity of a reinforced brigade position with complete artillery support, and they had been broken by it. The confidence that had been the Japanese military's greatest operational asset since December 1941 had taken its first serious wound. The bugle call in the pre-dawn jungle of Milne Bay was not simply a military signal. It was the first crack in something that had, until that morning, seemed unbreakable. Close saw what the night had produced and acted immediately. By early morning on the 31st, the Kitty Hawks were back at Guinea, refueled and rearmed. The 2nd 12th Battalion, the most experienced infantry unit at the bay, was ordered east along the northern shore toward KB Mission, with orders to pursue, engage, and destroy the retreating Japanese force. D Company led the advance along the coastal track, with the Kitty Hawks working the jungle on both flanks, flying at treetop height and strafing Japanese positions ahead of the infantry in close support that bordered on recklessness. One of the soldiers who made that advance described it vividly. Palm fronds, bullets, and dead Japanese snipers were pouring down with the rain. The pilots pressed so low on their runs that the ground crews could sometimes see mud on the belly of the aircraft when they landed. D Company reached KB Mission in the afternoon and assaulted it with bayonets. The fighting in and around the settlement lasted 40 minutes and was conducted at close quarters, men able to see each other's faces in the light filtering through the plantation palms. 60 Japanese were killed. A counterattack from the tree line was broken when A Company arrived in support. At KB Mission, the Australians found what Commander Hayashi's orders about striking without remorse had meant in practice. 36 Australian soldiers had been taken prisoner during the fighting of the preceding days. None had survived. Some had been tied to trees. Some had been used for bayonet practice while still alive. Others had been subjected to treatment that the military reports available to the public describe in careful euphemism, and the Webb Commission's classified documents described without restraint. Captain Angus Southers, who was with the section that made the discovery, put it plainly. KB Mission is where we found the Aussie prisoners, he said. Trussed to a tree and stabbed full of holes. The Japs had used them for bayonet practice. It was brutal, cruel, and inhuman. They behaved like bastards. Among the civilians of the Bay, the Commission would ultimately document 59 cases of murder, including women who had been sexually assaulted before being killed. Brigadier Field wrote in his personal diary on the day of the discovery, "The Yellow Devils show no mercy and have since had none from us." After that, there were no prisoners taken. Sergeant Arthur Trail of the 2nd 12th Battalion stated it without ambiguity. Our policy, he said, was to watch any apparent dead, shoot at the slightest sign of life, and stab with bayonet even the ones who appeared to be rotten. It was all out from then on, neither side showing any quarter. What the discovery at KB Mission did to the character of the pursuit that followed cannot be separated from what the pursuit then cost. The 2nd 9th and 2nd 12th Battalions pressing east along the North Shore were fighting with the particular fury that only atrocity can produce, the kind of anger that does not diminish with exhaustion, but burns hotter the more tired the body carrying it becomes. The Japanese rearguard fought back with the ferocity of men who understood what was behind them and what was in front of them. At every creek crossing along the track, at every stream that cut down from the mountains to the sea, the retiring Japanese dug in and made the advance pay for every 100 meters of progress. Between the 1st of September and the 5th, the 2 Australian battalions lost 45 men killed and 147 wounded in the pursuit phase alone. Japanese losses were proportionally catastrophic. At the Gama River, artillery and infantry fire killed at least 100 enemy soldiers in a single engagement. The force that had arrived at Milne Bay with an unbeaten record was retreating in disease and exhaustion toward a beach it had never expected to see again, fighting every step of the way because it had nowhere else to go and no other option available to it. On the 2nd of September, Commander Yano, himself wounded in the recent fighting, sent a radio message to the headquarters of the 8th Fleet at Rabaul. The message was brief. We have reached the worst possible situation. Admiral Mikawa received it, calculated his options, and offered to send a 1,900-man reinforcement if there was any possibility the troops ashore could hold out long enough to receive it. Yano's reply carried the finality of a man who had done his arithmetic and found no answer he could use. The troops on the ground, he said, were physically incapable of making a further stand. By the 4th of September, the Japanese force that had landed 2,800 men in total had exactly 50 soldiers fit for combat. Most of its commanders were dead. Its ammunition was nearly gone. Mikawa ordered the evacuation. It was on that same afternoon, in the hard fighting around the Guinea River, as the Australians pushed east toward the Japanese landing beach, that Corporal John French of the 2nd 9th Battalion performed the actions for which he was awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously. a company of the 2nd Ninth, advancing after a preliminary artillery and mortar bombardment, was stopped by concentrated fire from 3 Japanese machine gun posts covering the river crossing. The men went to ground. The attack was stalling. If it stalled completely, the Japanese rearguard would buy time for more of their number to reach the evacuation beach. French, who commanded the section pinned down nearest to the first post, ordered his men to take cover. Then he stood up and moved forward alone. He silenced the first post with grenades, crawling close enough to make the throws accurate before rising and putting them directly in. He came back to his section, collected more grenades, and attacked the second post the same way. Forward alone, under fire, to grenade range, and the gun fell silent. Then, with his Thompson submachine gun and nothing left to throw, he rose and charged the third post at a run, firing from the hip as he closed the distance. His section heard him take hits. They heard him keep moving. They heard the third gun fall silent. When they advanced to the third post, Jack French was lying in front of it, still alive, still conscious, mortally wounded. He knew what he had done and why. His section advanced through the ground his body had bought for them. He died shortly after they reached him. He was 28 years old. Dulcie was waiting in Australia. His brother Gordon would be killed in a bombing raid over Nuremberg 9 months later. His Victoria Cross citation, gazetted on the 12th of January 1943, said that by his cool courage and disregard of his own personal safety, this non-commissioned officer saved the members of his section from heavy casualties and was responsible for the successful conclusion of the attack. It was accurate, and it was entirely inadequate, as such citations always are when they attempt to compress a man's last act into a sentence. The evacuation began on the night of the 4th of September. The Japanese wounded were taken off first, loaded in darkness onto ships that entered the bay, while the Royal Australian Air Force was grounded. On the night of the 5th and 6th, the survivors of the main force assembled at the anchorage at Wagga Wagga, their original landing site, which they had departed 9 days earlier in the confident expectation of never needing it again. The 18th Brigade's forward elements were at that moment within earshot of the beach. They could hear movement in the trees ahead. They did not know that what they were hearing was the last Japanese departing. When dawn came on the 7th of September, the advance patrols found abandoned positions, discarded equipment, and a silence where 11 days of continuous sound had been. Organized Japanese resistance at Milne Bay had ceased. Of the 2,800 Japanese who had landed, 1,318 re-embarked. Around 750 lay dead around the bay and along the jungle tracks of the north shore. The remainder had attempted to escape overland through the mountains to the Japanese base at Buna on the north coast of Papua. None of them made it. Months after the battle, Australian patrols reported finding their skeletons in coastal caves and in the undergrowth along the mountain tracks. 2 Japanese soldiers, who had not been evacuated and could not escape, were encountered wandering in the grasslands near the bay by local Papuans, who drove them away with rocks whenever they tried to rest. At dusk, the 2 men hanged themselves from a tree. The rotting bodies of other Japanese soldiers lay in the streams and jungle edges around the bay for months afterward, until the environment absorbed them entirely. The Japanese dead were never gathered for burial. The Australian dead had been buried in a cemetery behind Gili Gili. The distinction was complete and permanent. Allied battle casualties numbered 377 in total, including 172 Australians killed or listed as missing in action. 14 Americans were killed in the fighting. The 36 Australian prisoners had been executed during the battle, and 59 Papuan civilians had been murdered. Evidence of these crimes was compiled by Sir William Webb, the Chief Justice of Queensland, who was appointed by the Australian government to investigate Japanese war crimes in the territory. The Webb Commission findings were submitted to the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal in 1947. No Japanese personnel were ever prosecuted. Not one. The second battle that followed the Japanese evacuation from Milne Bay was fought not in the jungle, but in memoranda and signal cables and careful administrative decisions, and it was in some ways less honorable than anything that had happened on the ground. MacArthur's general headquarters had spent the battle oscillating between demanding aggressive action and issuing warnings of Japanese reinforcements that did not materialize. One such warning, issued on the 1st of September, when the Japanese were already beginning their evacuation, had been taken seriously enough by Close that it delayed the advance of the 2nd 9th Battalion by a full day, while he verified that the threatened counterattack wasn't coming. It wasn't coming. The delay cost nothing militarily in the end, but it gave MacArthur something he found considerably more useful than a clean victory, a reason to question Close's urgency. The after-action critique arrived with a precision that suggested it had been composed before the fighting was over. General Sir Thomas Blamey, commanding Australian land forces, wrote to Rowell that it had appeared to those at headquarters as though by not acting with great speed, Close had risked missing the opportunity to deal completely with the enemy. MacArthur transmitted his own assessment to the War Department in Washington. Success at Milne Bay was attributable to good intelligence that had allowed him to concentrate a superior force and might not be repeatable. He noted specifically that the result should not be accepted as a measure of the relative fighting capacity of the troops involved. The man who had not visited Papua during the battle, who had supplied intelligence estimates that were wrong by a factor of 4, who had been pressuring Close for faster action while simultaneously warning him of threats that were not real, had decided that the men who won the first land victory of the Pacific War were not to be given credit for having won it. The victory was MacArthur's to claim. The performance of the troops was a caveat attached to it. The consequences for Close arrived with the logic of institutional punishment. Blamey's quarrel with Rowell in late September resulted in Rowell's dismissal from command in New Guinea. Close, who was Rowell's close friend and was understood by everyone in the command structure to be associated with him in Blamey's estimation, found himself without a single ally above him in the hierarchy. By early 1943, he had been assigned to the Victorian Lines of Communication area in Melbourne, the military's equivalent of a waiting room, where he managed administrative functions for the remainder of the war, while the campaign he had launched moved north without him. His half-brother Trevor was killed in the fighting at Guinea in November 1942, the youngest member of a family that had given multiple sons to the same war. Clowes contracted malaria and spent weeks in a hospital bed during the months when the campaign was developing into something larger and more decisive. He recovered. He returned to his desk. He remained there. For winning the first Allied land victory against Japan in the entire Second World War. For doing it with one inaccurate map, no coastal artillery, no searchlights, no barges, while being harangued by a general who had never left Brisbane and receiving false intelligence from that same general that delayed the decisive counterattack by a day. Major General Cyril Close received the Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 1943 and a desk in Melbourne for the rest of the war. Colonel Chilton's assessment has not aged poorly in the decade since he offered it. The only thing I think he can be criticized for, Chilton said, is his lack of public relations, for not sending back phony reports about what a wonderful job he was doing. His reports were confined to purely military operations and did not give the boys back in Melbourne what they wanted. At that stage, most of them did not have a clue about fighting battles anyway. What was being buried was not merely the credit due to one general, it was the full significance of what Milne Bay had actually accomplished for the course of the war. The defeat at Milne Bay did not simply stop the Japanese at the eastern tip of New Guinea. It caused the Japanese withdrawal on the Kokoda Track. The forces fighting their way toward Port Moresby along that jungle path had been counting on Milne Bay airfields for the air cover their final push would require. When the bay was lost and the airfields remained in Allied hands, the air cover for the Kokoda thrust was gone. The order to withdraw on Kokoda was issued partly as a direct consequence of what had happened 300 kilometers to the east. The two battles, Kokoda and Milne Bay, were fought simultaneously through the same weeks of August and September 1942, and they saved Port Moresby together. Without Milne Bay, the story of Kokoda almost certainly ends differently. One of those battles is engraved in Australian national memory with the full weight of that country's martial tradition. The other is, for most people outside Australia, and for many within it, essentially unknown. MacArthur's insistence on minimizing its significance has proven extraordinarily durable. Field Marshal Sir William Slim, who commanded British forces in Burma through some of the most punishing fighting of the entire war, and who had every professional reason to understand the significance of what Milne Bay represented, wrote about the battle with a directness that many more senior figures had conspicuously avoided. Australian troops had, at Milne Bay, inflicted on the Japanese their first undoubted defeat on land. His reasoning was not sentimental. It was operational. If the Australians, in conditions very like ours, had done it, so could we. Then came the sentence that carries the full weight of the achievement. Some of us may forget that of all the Allies, it was the Australian soldiers who first broke the spell of the invincibility of the Japanese army. Those of us who were in Burma have cause to remember. Slim understood something that MacArthur spent years trying to obscure, that the psychological impact of the first Allied land victory against Japan was not confined to New Guinea. It rippled outward through every theater where Allied soldiers were fighting the same enemy and asking themselves the same question about whether it could be done. The spell. That single word is the most important one in Slim's assessment, because it identifies precisely what Milne Bay accomplished that a casualty figure or a battle honor cannot capture. Not a position, not a unit, not a landing had been stopped before Milne Bay. The psychological operating assumption that had governed every Allied military calculation in the Pacific since December 1941. The certainty that the Japanese on land could not be turned back had been broken by a force of part-time citizen soldiers and Royal Australian Air Force pilots in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The soldiers of the British 14th Army fighting through the jungles of Burma drew direct operational confidence from what Australians had accomplished at a place most of them had never heard of, in a swamp most of them could not locate on a map. It mattered beyond the immediate tactical situation. It saved lives on a front thousands of kilometers away from the bay where it happened. The militia. This deserves to be stated plainly, because MacArthur's contemptuous dismissal of them as unreliable has been allowed to stand as received historical wisdom for far too long. The 9th, 25th, and 61st Battalions absorbed the first shock of the Japanese assault with no functioning anti-tank weapons. They faced armored vehicles they had no means of stopping. They were pushed backward over 3 consecutive nights of fighting in rain and darkness against tanks and elite naval infantry, and they were pushed backward only because any infantry without functioning anti-tank weapons will eventually give ground to armor. They were not routed. They were not broken. They did not abandon their positions without orders. They slowed a force that had rolled through Malaya and the Philippines and every other opposition it had met. And they slowed it long enough for the artillery to be registered, and the veterans to be deployed, and the Kitty Hawks to destroy the enemy's supplies. Sergeant Steele and 16 men at a cleared dispersal bay, holding the line for 3 hours in the pre-dawn darkness. The 25th Battalion standing through 3 nights of assault before the veterans of the 18th Brigade were committed. the 61st Battalion at KB Mission, fighting with bayonets against tanks. These were not the soldiers MacArthur had described. They were something considerably more than that, and they had proved it, at a cost that the general in Brisbane could not bring himself to acknowledge, without also acknowledging the limits of his own judgment. The Yushukan War Museum in Tokyo, which presents the history of Japanese military operations to the Japanese public, makes no mention of the Battle of Milne Bay. Japan's first land defeat of the entire war, the battle that broke what Slim called a spell, has been removed from the institutional memory of the nation that suffered it. This is its own kind of verdict on what happened in that swamp, and on how badly the truth of what happened there has been managed by every institution with an interest in a different story. Cyril Close retired from the Army on the 1st of June 1949 with the honorary rank of Lieutenant General. He spent his remaining years gardening and playing golf in Melbourne, described by everyone who knew him as a man of great quality and very few public words, which was entirely consistent with how he had spent his career. He gave one interview about his service to a journalist researching the Papuan campaign, and it was thorough, precise, and professionally unrevealing in the manner of a man who had spent decades keeping his own counsel and saw no reason to change that now. He died on the 19th of May, 1968, at the Repatriation General Hospital in Heidelberg, and was buried with full military honors in Springvale Cemetery, survived by his daughter. The Australian Women's Weekly had run a full-page story on the Clowes family at the height of the battle in 1942. The decades that followed did not return the attention. John French is buried at the Bomana War Cemetery outside Port Moresby. His fiancée, Dulcie, attended no ceremony when the Victoria Cross was gazetted in January of 1943, because the gazettal was the first confirmation she received that he was dead. His brother Gordon was killed over Nuremberg in August of that year. Two brothers from the same Queensland town, gone to the same war within 9 months of each other, neither of them coming home. Peter Turnbull is buried at Bomana as well, not far from the man he never met. The strip nearest to where he died still carries his name. On the 25th of August, 1942, the landing barges had carried meteorological equipment into Milne Bay. They had carried spare aircraft belly tanks. They had carried a petrol tanker because the airfields would be operational within hours and the aircraft would need fueling before the morning was out. Everything that came after, the possession, the base, the air cover for Kokoda, the next phase of the advance toward Port Moresby, was so certain that the staff officers planning Operation RE had simply written it into the logistics list and moved on to the next item. The barges burned on the beach. The meteorological equipment went into the bay. The tanks dissolved into the mud that the people who lived there had always known would defeat anything that tried to move through it quickly. The force that had been ordered to strike without remorse left its dead unburied in the streams and swamps and coastal caves of the eastern tip of New Guinea, where they lay for months until the environment absorbed them. The Australians they had come to bury had buried them instead. That is not a figure of speech. It is exactly what happened. The men who broke the spell were part-time soldiers, fighter pilots, artillerymen who had pre-registered their targets with professional patience, a sergeant who understood what a cleared aircraft bay could do for a machine gun, and a barber's son from Queensland with a Thompson submachine gun and 3 machine gun posts between him and his section. They did it in mud and rain and endemic malaria, against an enemy that had never lost on land, commanded by a general who refused to send phony reports and was punished for winning because of it. MacArthur took the credit. The institutional record minimized the achievement. The Japanese museum erased it entirely. Slim told the truth. Now you do too. Tell me in the comments, had you heard of Milne Bay before today? because the soldiers who held that line deserve at least to be remembered, even 80 years later, even this far from the bay where they changed the war.